Good evening, and welcome to Bedtime Biographies, a quiet place where history softens its voice and remarkable lives become stories to drift into sleep. Tonight, we follow the echo of a name that never truly faded, a face so familiar it feels timeless, staring out from posters, murals, and worn t-shirts across the world. A symbol of rebellion, often remembered, yet rarely understood. He was a healer who chose violence, an idealist who embraced bloodshed, a man who helped ignite a revolution in Cuba, then walked away from power, comfort, and fame to chase a dream that would end in a lonely Bolivian ravine. In 1967, bullets ended his life. His enemies believed that with his body, the revolution would be buried. They were wrong. In death, he became something far greater, an idea without borders, a myth without a grave. Ernesto Che Guevara became more powerful after his final breath than he ever was in life. Tonight, we won't shout slogans or argue politics. Instead, we slow down. We peel back the layers of legend to meet the restless, complicated human beneath the icon. More than half a century later, the world still cannot let him go. And by the end of this story, you may understand why. So settle in. Let the noise of the day dissolve into the darkness. Allow this story to carry you gently through a life that refused to be ordinary. If these quiet journeys through history help you unwind, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps other restless minds find their way here too. And tell us in the comments, which historical figure should keep you company next time? Now, close your eyes, breathe slowly, and begin drifting into the bedtime biography of Che Guevara. Chapter 1. A Childhood Wrapped in Fiction. The first truth about Ernesto Guevara was hidden inside a document. According to the official record, signed, stamped, and preserved by the Argentine state, he was born on June 14, 1928. But that date was a careful fiction. In reality, Ernesto arrived 1 month earlier, on May 14th, entering the world already wrapped in secrecy. For his mother, Celia de la Serna, that lie was not a matter of convenience. It was survival. In conservative Argentina of the 1920s, a bride discovered to be pregnant before marriage did not face gossip alone. She faced permanent social exile. Families were ruined by such scandals. Reputations collapsed overnight. So a solution was arranged quietly. A trusted family doctor, discreet, respected, and willing to bend the rules, altered the paperwork. A single adjusted date. A small lie, meant to seal a much larger one. Ernesto's parents came from old, proud lineages. His father, Ernesto Guevara Lynch, was a restless man, imaginative, unconventional, drawn more to ideals than stability. His own grandfather had once ranked among South America's wealthiest elites, though that fortune had long since vanished. His mother, Celia, represented something even older: Argentine aristocracy. Her family tree reached back to colonial power. One ancestor had governed Peru as a Spanish royal viceroy. To escape the quiet judgment of Buenos Aires society, the newlyweds fled the capital. They traveled north, deep into Misiones province, one of the most remote regions in Argentina. There, surrounded by dense jungle and endless rain, they purchased land using Celia's inheritance and carved out a yerba mate plantation near Puerto Caraguatay. Among the howler monkeys and red clay soil, no one asked about wedding dates. But the jungle revealed other truths. The local labor system relied on the mensu, workers trapped in permanent debt, paid in company credit instead of money, their wages consumed before they ever reached their hands by rigged ledgers and company stores. Most plantation owners accepted this system. Many profited from it. Ernesto Guevara Lynch did not. He insisted on paying his workers in cash, refusing the debt schemes that bound men to endless labor. Neighbors considered him naive. Some thought him dangerous. Others simply thought him mad. This contradiction, wealth built from land, yet a refusal to accept its cruelty, defined the household into which Ernesto was born. A child whose life began with a concealed truth. Raised by parents who rejected the injustices they were expected to accept, it was here, in this uneasy balance between privilege and rebellion, that the roots of a future revolutionary took hold. The intolerance for exploitation, the anger at suffering, the refusal to look away. Long before the world knew the name Che, those instincts were already forming, quietly, in the jungle, beneath the sound of falling rain. Chapter 2. Breathing Against Fate. When Ernesto was barely 2 years old, his body delivered its first warning. It happened quietly, almost carelessly. A family trip to the seaside. A swim in water colder than expected. Nothing dramatic, until night fell. The coughing began after sunset. By morning, it had deepened into something far more serious. When the doctor finally spoke, his words carried weight far beyond a childhood illness. Chronic asthma. Not temporary. Not curable. A condition that would follow Ernesto for the rest of his life. The attacks came without rhythm or mercy. His chest would seize. Each breath turned into a struggle, shallow and panicked. Some nights, his parents found him sitting upright in bed, leaning forward, gasping for air. His lips faintly blue in the dark. Doctors warned that the damp climate of Misiones was now dangerous for him. Even their home near San Isidro, by the Rio de la Plata, proved too humid. The family did what desperate parents often do. They moved. On medical advice, the Guevaras relocated to Alta Gracia, a small spa town in Córdoba province, known for its dry air and reputation as a refuge for the chronically ill. They did not settle easily. First Villa Chicha, then Villa Nidia, then another house after that. Each move was an experiment, a search for the precise balance of altitude and air that might allow their son to breathe without fear. Alta Gracia was filled with children like Ernesto, children with asthma, with tuberculosis, with wasting illnesses doctors could barely name. It was a town people came to when other options had already failed. And yet, something unexpected happened there. The illness confined Ernesto to bed for days, sometimes weeks. During those stretches, he read constantly. Adventure stories, poetry, history, philosophy. Books became both escape and endurance training. But when his lungs allowed him to stand, he became something entirely different. Reckless, provocative, almost defiant. Ernesto seemed determined to challenge death directly, as if daring it to finish what his lungs had started. He ran with local street gangs, small groups of boys who ruled neighborhoods with stones and slingshots, defending invisible borders with absolute seriousness. Thin, wheezing, often breathless, Ernesto charged forward when others hesitated. He jumped when caution would have been wiser. Pain did not stop him. Fear did not slow him. Stories spread quickly. He dangled by his hands from railway bridges while trains roared past overhead. He swallowed ink on a dare, ate chalk in class simply to shock his teachers. Once, knowing a strict teacher intended to strike him, he slipped a brick into his trousers. When her hand came down, she screamed in pain. Ernesto accepted his punishment afterward without a sound. At home, chaos was constant. His mother, Celia, was already a local anomaly. One of the first women in Altagracia to drive a car, to wear trousers in public, to openly defy social expectations. The house overflowed with books, papers, half-finished arguments, and children from every social class. The sons of servants mixed with the children of professionals. Anyone curious enough to talk was welcome. But behind the bohemian disorder, the family was unraveling. Money was always uncertain. His father's business ventures rarely succeeded. Arguments erupted into shouting matches that echoed through the walls. There were other women. Always other women. When the noise became unbearable, young Ernesto fled. He disappeared into the hills outside town, wandering alone for hours, breathing dry air into damaged lungs, learning early how to endure pain in silence. Asthma shaped his body, but resistance shaped his character. He learned to live as if every breath were borrowed, and to spend it recklessly. Chapter 3. Learning how the world breaks. When Ernesto was 10 years old, a distant war reached into his home and quietly rearranged his inner world. The Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936, and every evening, the Guevara family gathered around the radio, listening as the Republican government fought for survival against General Francisco Franco and his fascist forces. For most children, it was just noise, voices crackling across the Atlantic. For Ernesto, it became instruction. He spread a map of Spain across the dining table. With colored pins and scraps of paper, he marked troop movements, followed sieges, tracked victories and collapses with the focus of someone studying a living system. The Guevaras were committed Republicans. Defeat was felt personally. When another city fell, the house grew heavy with silence. When the Republic managed a rare success, the mood lifted as if a festival had arrived early. His father helped establish Acción Argentina, an organization supporting the Allied cause and opposing fascism abroad. Ernesto joined its youth circle, though he cared less for demonstrations than for understanding how wars were actually won and lost. Formal schooling held little appeal. At the Dane Funes National College, he attended classes but rarely engaged. Teachers saw him present, but his attention lived elsewhere. His real education took place after hours, in books consumed at speed, and in notebooks filled with dense, slanted handwriting. He read widely and without guidance, moving from medicine to psychology, from poetry to political theory. He grew close to the Granado brothers, Alberto and Tomás, future partners in exploration and argument. They teased him for his severe haircut, calling him El Pelado. Sport offered another transformation. On the rugby field, Ernesto became Furibundo Serna, the raging Serna. Despite lungs that often betrayed him, he played with startling aggression, charging into scrums, tackling players far larger than himself, shouting as he ran. Teammates learned to recognize a certain look, the moment just before he attempted something either brilliant or disastrous. Often, it was both. By 17, Ernesto began keeping what he called his philosophical notebooks. 7 volumes eventually filled with reflections, quotations, and arguments, engaging with Freud, Darwin, Nietzsche, and Marx. He copied passages carefully, then challenged them, testing ideas as if they were hypotheses. He even attempted Das Kapital, annotating an abridged edition line by line, though years later he would admit he barely understood it at the time. For all this reading, he was not yet a political actor. When Alberto Granado was jailed for participating in an anti-government protest, students organized a march demanding his release. They asked Ernesto to join them. He refused. Protest without force, he believed, changed nothing. Later, he told Alberto he would only march if someone placed a revolver in his hand. Words alone, he said, were insufficient. This was Ernesto in Altagracia, still forming, still unresolved. An aristocrat who preferred the company of servants, an intellectual who distrusted theory, a student of revolution unwilling to participate in symbolic action. He absorbed the world carefully, recording its contradictions, studying its injustices, preparing, though he did not yet know for what. History was instructing him, and Ernesto, as always. Chapter 4: A Continent as a Classroom. In 1952, at the age of 23, Ernesto Guevara set out on a journey that was never meant to be comfortable and would never allow him to remain the same. He climbed onto a battered Norton 500 motorcycle, christened La Poderosa, the Mighty One. It leaked oil, protested every hill, and carried two riders who believed ambition could compensate for mechanical reality. Ernesto sat behind his friend Alberto Granado, 6 years older and equally hungry for the road. Their dream was absurdly large: to cross South America and, somehow, keep going north. The motorcycle would not make it that far. It surrendered in southern Chile. But before it failed completely, it delivered them into a world neither had truly known. To eat, to sleep, to move forward, they became improvisers, survivors. They told strangers they were specialists in leprosy research, touring the continent to study treatment centers. The claim was wildly exaggerated and astonishingly effective. Local newspapers announced the arrival of Argentine medical experts. Hospital directors welcomed them warmly, served meals, nodded gravely as the young men examined equipment they barely understood. The journey was a chain of mishaps. In a Chilean village, drunk on pisco and bravado, Ernesto attempted to escort a married woman into the night. Her husband objected, forcefully. The two Argentines fled through darkness, stones whistling past their heads, laughter and wheezing breath mixing as they ran. But the road was not only comedy. In the Atacama Desert, they encountered a communist miner and his wife, shivering beneath the open sky. Blacklisted for demanding fair wages, the couple wandered from mine to mine, denied work everywhere. Ernesto gave them his blanket and lay awake beside the cold earth, watching them cling to one another for warmth. These were not ideas from books, not theories, not slogans. They were people, with names, with faces, with nowhere left to go. In Valparaiso, he spent the night beside an elderly woman dying of asthma and heart failure in a filthy, airless room. Her family was gone, not from cruelty, but exhaustion and poverty. As he listened to her breathing, ragged and strained, Ernesto recognized his own illness in her struggle, a vision of his possible future. Later, he would write of the tragedy endured by the proletariat. But what haunted him was simpler: this room, this woman, and the unbearable loneliness of dying poor. When La Poderosa finally collapsed, the journey did not end. They traveled on foot, by truck, by boat, by any means available. They worked aboard a freighter, volunteered at the San Pablo leper colony, and drank heavily in Colombian bars when the road allowed celebration. With every mile, something fell away. The privileged Argentine medical student thinned, peeled back, eroded by exposure. By the time they reached Venezuela, Ernesto understood what had happened. The person who began the journey no longer existed. He wrote that he had died somewhere along the road, perhaps in the desert night, perhaps in that cramped room overlooking the sea. The continent itself had educated him, not through lectures, but through hunger, illness, injustice, and human closeness. He had seen the skeletal structure of Latin America, the shared suffering beneath borders, the quiet violence holding it all together. No university could have taught him that. And once learned, it could not be unlearned. Chapter 5. When Hope Was Washed Away. In 1953, Ernesto Guevara traveled to Guatemala, drawn by a dangerous question. Could a revolution succeed without rifles, without firing squads, without blood? President Jacobo Arbenz was attempting what few had dared to try in Latin America, a social transformation through democratic means. Land reform, labor protections, recognition of indigenous dignity. For Ernesto, this was not theory, it was a test. He arrived with his friend Carlos Calica Ferrer, who was far more interested in beer and romance than ideology, but followed anyway. Guatemala City was alive with argument. Political exiles from across the continent filled cafes and boarding houses, each table a different faction, each conversation an autopsy of Latin America's failures. Ernesto found his circle quickly. There was Hilda Gadea, a Peruvian economist of Chinese descent, brilliant, disciplined, and uncompromising. She worked within Arbenz's government and moved effortlessly through its inner world. There were Cuban exiles too, survivors of Fidel Castro's failed attack on the Moncada barracks, wounded by defeat but already planning what would come next. The Argentine lawyer Ricardo Rojo joined them, and nights passed dissecting the continent's problems with clinical intensity, as if injustice could be diagnosed and excised like diseased tissue. Above it all, Ernesto watched Arbenz govern. The president's most dangerous act was also his most modest, redistributing unused land from the United Fruit Company to peasants who had worked it for generations. United Fruit owned ports, railroads, and more arable land than the Guatemalan state itself. Arbenz intended to change that. Washington noticed. By June 1954, the response arrived. The CIA, having labeled Arbenz a communist threat, funded and organized a mercenary force calling itself the Liberation Army. It was small, but designed to appear overwhelming. Planes flew over the capital, dropping leaflets and occasional bombs. Pirate radio stations broadcast fabricated victories. Psychological warfare turned hundreds into thousands. The illusion worked. Ernesto tried to join the defense. He appeared at government offices demanding a rifle. There were none to give. Arbenz hesitated. Committed to legality, terrified of civil war, he refused to arm the population. He still believed in constitutions, procedures, rules. His enemies believed only in force. Ernesto watched this paralysis with mounting fury. The moment demanded action and received debate. While mercenaries advanced, officials checked legal boundaries instead of ammunition supplies. The collapse came quickly. The army withdrew its support. Arbenz resigned rather than fight. He delivered his farewell speech over the radio as Ernesto listened, motionless, enraged. The president sought refuge in the Mexican embassy. The land returned to United Fruit. The peasants returned to hunger. What followed was quieter and worse. Thousands were arrested, tortured, disappeared. The crime was belief. The punishment was example. Ernesto would later describe Guatemala as a terrible shower of cold water. The phrase was inadequate. What washed over him was certainty. Democracy, he concluded, was permitted only when it posed no threat. Elections meant nothing if power sat elsewhere, armed and impatient. Guatemala taught him that partial revolutions fail, that hesitation is fatal, that compromise invites destruction. He fled to Mexico, carrying a lesson that would never loosen its grip. You could not negotiate with empire. You either dismantled it completely or waited for it to dismantle you. The student was gone. In his place stood a man who no longer believed change could survive without force. Chapter 6. The Night Purpose Found Him. In July 1955, inside a modest apartment belonging to Maria Antonia Gonzalez in Mexico City, Ernesto Guevara encountered the man who would finally give direction to his fury. Fidel Castro did not enter a room quietly. He occupied it, with movement, with gesture, with voice. Recently released from a Cuban prison, he spoke as if time itself were impatient. He was already planning to return to Cuba, already describing the fall of Fulgencio Batista as if it were inevitable. The confidence bordered on madness. Ernesto was transfixed. They spoke through the night. Fidel painted a portrait of a nation sold off in pieces, casinos and brothels serving American tourists, while rural Cuba starved in silence. Corruption as routine, poverty as policy. By dawn, the decision was made. Ernesto would join the expedition as its doctor. It took Fidel 10 hours to recruit him. Later, Ernesto would say it should have taken 10 minutes. He had been waiting for this conversation since Guatemala collapsed. The following year was devoted to preparation. In the hills and firing ranges outside Mexico City, the Cuban exiles trained relentlessly. They practiced marksmanship at Los Gamitos, learned guerrilla warfare from a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, and pushed their bodies up volcanic slopes until lungs burned and legs failed. Fidel placed Ernesto in charge of a safe house, a decision that irritated some Cubans. Who was this Argentine to issue instructions? But Ernesto's intensity was undeniable. He endured more, demanded more, pressed harder than anyone else. Gradually, resistance turned into respect. Life, however, refused to simplify itself. In August 1955, Hilda Gadea became pregnant. They married out of obligation rather than romance. Their daughter, Hilda Beatriz, was born in February 1956. Ernesto loved the child, but domestic life felt like confinement. He was studying war while folding diapers. The contradiction gnawed at him. Then, in June, everything unraveled. Mexican police raided the training camp. Someone had informed, likely for money. Ernesto was arrested and spent 57 days in prison. There, he made a decision that nearly ended everything. When interrogated, he did not dissemble. Yes, he was a communist. Yes, he believed armed revolution was necessary. Yes, he believed capitalism was approaching its end. Fidel was furious. He had been cultivating a moderate image, speaking of democracy, legality, constitutions. Now his Argentine doctor had shattered the illusion. Yet Fidel did not abandon him. Perhaps he saw conviction where others saw recklessness. Perhaps he recognized something useful, a man incapable of lying about belief. Every revolution requires its pragmatists and its martyrs. Ernesto was already moving toward the second role. On November 25, 1956, 82 men crowded onto a small yacht named the Granma. It was designed for 8. They sailed anyway. Seasickness overwhelmed nearly everyone. The boat leaked. Supplies soaked and spoiled. The crossing, meant to last 5 days, stretched to 7. They were meant to land at night. Instead, they arrived in daylight, stranded in a mangrove swamp, exhausted, exposed, already behind schedule. Before a single shot was fired, the expedition was failing. But there was no turning back. The meeting in Mexico had set events in motion, and history, once stirred, rarely pauses for second thoughts. Chapter 7. Baptized by the Mountains. 3 days after landing in Cuba, the revolution met reality. At Alegría de Pio, government troops lay hidden among the sugarcane, waiting. When the first shots cracked the morning air, the rebel column disintegrated. Men ran in every direction, confusion replacing courage in an instant. Ernesto felt a violent blow to his neck, then warmth. Blood spread across his chest. He collapsed behind a tree, certain of only one thing. This was the end. Perhaps of his life. Perhaps of the revolution itself. Beside him lay 2 objects, a medical kit and a box of ammunition. For a moment, the doctor reached for the bandages. Then he stopped. He chose the bullets. Much later, Ernesto would describe this as the instant he ceased to be merely a physician and became a guerrilla. Medicine could wait. History could not. Believing death inevitable, he resolved to meet it with dignity. He recalled a story by Jack London, a man facing death calmly in frozen Alaska. If he was going to die, he would do so deliberately, with composure. Juan Almeida found him there, lying still, collecting himself as though preparing for a final performance. Almeida had no patience for tragedy. "Nobody dies today," he said. "Get up, run." And so Ernesto ran, blood streaming from his neck, through the cane fields and into the jungle. Behind them, captured rebels were executed. The expedition that had promised to free Cuba had survived 3 days. The survivors drifted into the Sierra Maestra like phantoms. Ernesto later called them an army of shadows, and even that was generous. Of the 82 men who had left Mexico, only 22 would eventually regroup. They survived on almost nothing. They drank moisture collected from binocular lenses. They chewed raw corn stolen from peasant fields. They hid by day, moved by night, learning the mountains by starlight. Their survival depended on others. Celia Sanchez had spent months preparing the ground, quietly building a network of peasant supporters, persuading farmers to hide food, store weapons, carry messages. Guides like Guillermo Garcia led them along trails invisible to army patrols. Slowly, painfully, the fragments found one another. When Ernesto's group finally reunited with Fidel Castro, the reunion was tense. Weapons had been lost. In Fidel's logic, losing a rifle was worse than losing a man. But they were alive, and that was enough. The mountains began their instruction. Every ravine became a lesson. Every exploited farmer a potential ally. Every failed army patrol strengthened the myth. The government announced the rebels were dead. Havana newspapers published obituaries. Batista's generals celebrated. High in the Sierra Maestra, those supposed corpses were learning how to fight. Ernesto's wound healed into a scar he would carry for the rest of his life. The revolution that had supposedly died was, in truth, being born. Through hunger, exhaustion, blood, and the kind of suffering that either destroys a person or forges them into something as unyielding as the mountains themselves. Chapter 8. Discipline in the Shadows. The mountains were quiet that morning. Too quiet. The peasant guide moved ahead of the column, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cool air. He had guided rebels through these trails for weeks, but something about him had changed. Ernesto noticed first. He later said betrayal had a scent, subtle but unmistakable once you learned it. They searched the man's pockets. Inside, folded carefully, was an army-issued safe conduct pass. The truth settled heavily among them. This was not his first deception. He had already led them once into danger. There would be no second time. The trial took place beneath the trees, without ceremony, without delay. The man confessed, spoke of hunger, of children, of fear. No one interrupted him. Everyone understood the reasons. That did not change the outcome. Silence stretched. No one wanted the responsibility. Ernesto stepped forward. He did not speak. He raised his pistol and fired. The echo rolled through the jungle, brief, final. That day, the revolution crossed a line. It learned that survival demanded cruelty, and that ideals offered no protection from hard decisions. In February 1957, the dead returned to life. An American journalist, Herbert Matthews of the New York Times, made the long climb into the Sierra Maestra, seeking confirmation of rumors. Fidel Castro understood the moment immediately. He staged the interview like a performance. The same fighters marched past repeatedly, changing hats, changing jackets, becoming many instead of few. Victories were described before they existed. Territory was claimed before it was held. Matthews believed what he saw, or perhaps what he wanted to see. When the articles appeared, everything shifted. The rebels were no longer fugitives. They were a movement. Money flowed from sympathizers. Young men began arriving in the mountains. Batista's government insisted the rebels were dead, and now looked either dishonest or dangerously blind. The myth had escaped control, and in guerrilla war, myth was a weapon as powerful as any rifle. That summer, Fidel summoned Ernesto. The announcement was brief. There would be no ceremony. He was being promoted to Comandante, a rank shared only with Fidel himself. He would command his own column, his own territory, his own failures. The message carried another edge. The same day, Raúl Castro was demoted for disobedience. Blood meant nothing. Discipline meant everything. Ernesto established his base in the El Hombrito Valley. There he began shaping something larger than a fighting unit. A hospital appeared among the trees. A bread oven filled the camp with unfamiliar comfort. An armory became a classroom where peasants learned to care for weapons they had never before been allowed to touch. He founded a newspaper, El Cubano Libre, and taught his soldiers to read using stories of their own struggle. Execution at dawn, literacy lessons by midday. This was the paradox taking shape. Ernesto was no longer only fighting Batista's regime. He was constructing the world he believed must follow it, patiently, rigidly, one rule, one lesson, one example at a time. The asthmatic doctor from Argentina was disappearing. In his place stood something more severe, more demanding. A commander who believed revolution did not merely overthrow governments, but reshaped human beings themselves. Chapter 9. The City That Broke the Regime. In August 1958, Fidel Castro handed Ernesto an order that bordered on madness. He was to leave the safety of the Sierra Maestra, lead his column westward across Cuba, and sever the island in two. What followed was not a march, but an ordeal. For 6 weeks, the rebels crossed swamps and open plains with no cover and little food. They consumed their horses, then boiled leather belts, then endured long days with nothing at all. Government aircraft hunted them from the sky. At night, mosquitoes and fever finished what hunger had begun. Ernesto once again called them an army of shadows. But these shadows were advancing, and the state was retreating. At the end of the march stood Santa Clara, a provincial capital of nearly 150,000 people, defended by more than 3,500 government troops. Ernesto had fewer than 400 fighters, most of them peasants who had learned to shoot among mountain trees, not city streets. By any conventional measure, the numbers were absurd. But Batista's army was collapsing from within. Morale was thin, loyalty thinner still. Men who fought for salaries could not withstand those who believed the future depended on them. The city's backbone was an armored train sent from Havana as reinforcement. 22 steel cars, packed with weapons, ammunition, and hundreds of soldiers. It sat on the tracks like an untouchable relic of state power. Ernesto studied it carefully. He did not see protection. He saw confinement. A bulldozer was quietly taken from the university. Rails were loosened. Steel was persuaded to fail. On December 29th, the train entered the trap. At full speed, it struck the damaged tracks. Cars twisted, piled onto one another, and collapsed in chaos. Molotov cocktails followed. Fire turned armored steel into furnaces. Inside, soldiers faced a final calculation: burn or surrender. They chose surrender. As word spread, Santa Clara's resistance dissolved. Entire units abandoned their posts. The police chief defected. Even criminal figures, sensing the inevitable, offered assistance. Ernesto continued to lead from the front. During the fighting, he fractured his elbow, falling from a wall. His arm was bound and useless, but his voice carried constantly, directing assaults on the police headquarters, the jail, the provincial government buildings. By New Year's Eve, the truth had reached Havana. In the early hours of January 1st, 1959, Fulgencio Batista fled Cuba, leaving behind a nation and departing with millions in stolen wealth. The message reached Santa Clara at dawn. The city had fallen. The regime had collapsed. In the central plaza, rifles fired into the sky. Crowds poured into the streets, celebrating an end few had believed possible only months before. Ernesto stood apart, his injured arm throbbing, watching history rearrange itself. Victory, he understood, was only the beginning. Seizing power was simple compared to what followed. The deeper struggle, the one that reshaped minds, values, and expectations, had not yet begun. The war was over. The revolution was just entering its most dangerous phase. Chapter 10. The Fortress of Judgment. When Ernesto arrived in Havana, Fidel Castro did not place him at Camp Colombia, the symbolic heart of the old army. That role went to Camilo Cienfuegos, charismatic, smiling, beloved. Ernesto was sent elsewhere. He was given La Cabaña, an ancient stone fortress overlooking the bay, a place where colonial Spain once executed rebels and where echoes had learned how to remember screams. Fidel understood roles. Every revolution needs its light and its shadow. La Cabaña would become the revolution's courtroom. Ernesto would become its final voice. As chief authority over revolutionary tribunals, he oversaw the trials of the defeated regime's enforcers, interrogators, executioners, informants, men whose power had ended the moment Batista fled. Each night, the fortress filled again, cells crowded with the accused. Victims and families arrived with testimonies carried for years, like unhealed wounds. Ernesto did not preside over every hearing. Others handled the proceedings. But every death sentence passed through him. The power was quiet, a signature, a mark of ink. The trials moved quickly. Evidence was spoken, not debated. The accused were allowed to speak, though mercy was rarely found in their words. By midnight, decisions were final. After dark, the condemned were taken to the wall. They were offered a blindfold. They were offered a priest. Many refused both. Rifles fired. Stone absorbed the sound. Dawn arrived as if nothing had happened. Within weeks, the number reached into the hundreds. To supporters, this was justice, a cleansing after years of fear. To critics, it was vengeance, summary punishment dressed in law. Ernesto did not waver. He believed history had already taught the lesson. In Guatemala, mercy had failed. Hesitation had invited destruction. This time, the revolution would not wait for its enemies to organize. Each execution, in his mind, was a coup that would never occur. A conspiracy extinguished before it could breathe. Justice, as he practiced it, was preventative, clinical, irreversible. His father visited from Argentina during this time. The man who had watched his son become a doctor now stood inside a fortress of death. "You studied medicine to save lives," he said quietly. "Now you end them." Ernesto laughed, not with humor, but with certainty. He joked that he should open a new clinic, a practice without risk, where people came not to be cured, but to be finished. The words fell between them, heavy and unresolved. Ernesto rarely witnessed the executions himself. Others pulled the triggers, but everyone understood where the authority lay. His pen carried more finality than any rifle in the fortress. Between sips of mate tea, between reports and documents, he decided who would not see another sunrise. The revolution had forged him into what it required, a man capable of doing what others could not, without pause, without doubt, without sleep lost to conscience. La Cabaña did not make Ernesto Guevara ruthless. It revealed how far he was willing to go once he believed history had given him permission. Chapter 11. Engineering the Revolutionary Soul. When the fighting ended, the revolution did something strange. It put Ernesto Guevara behind a desk. First, they made him president of the National Bank. It was Fidel's idea of humor. Ernesto knew nothing about finance, except that banks had always stood on the wrong side of history. When new Cuban peso notes were printed, he signed them with a single word: Che. Not a name, a mark. Like graffiti, sprayed across the machinery of money itself. Later they gave him more: the Ministry of Industries. The guerrilla from the mountains was now responsible for factories, production plans, and an economy he had once sworn to dismantle. But Ernesto was not interested in managing scarcity. He was trying to redesign human behavior. He spoke often of El Hombre Nuevo, the new man. A person who worked not for wages, but for purpose. Not for reward, but for belonging. Material incentives, he argued, were a disease. Bonuses, privileges, special treatment, all remnants of capitalist thinking. A true revolutionary labored long hours because the work itself was moral. The ego dissolved into the collective. The self disappeared into history. He demanded this standard first of himself. He lived on a modest salary, refused luxury, rejected comfort. When one of his deputies arrived in a luxury car, Ernesto ordered it returned immediately. Revolutionaries were examples, not beneficiaries. Those who worked under him described the experience as exhausting and absolute. One said it was like working for Christ, if Christ carried a rifle and never accepted excuses. The Soviet advisors were alarmed. They had built socialism through quotas, bonuses, punishments, through systems refined over decades. Now this Argentine doctor was telling them they had misunderstood everything. In closed meetings, Ernesto was blunt. "You are not building socialism," he said. "You are building state capitalism." He warned that incentives would rot the system from within, that a society built on rewards would one day collapse back into greed. The room would fall silent. No one spoke that way to Moscow, especially not while depending on Soviet oil, grain, and weapons. Privately, Ernesto was harsher still. He believed the Soviet Union had betrayed Marx, that they had replaced Wall Street with the Kremlin and called it progress. They believed people worked only for personal gain. Ernesto believed that assumption was fatal. Socialism built with capitalist tools, he said, was like performing surgery with a machine gun. It might function, but the patient would not survive. For officials who failed his standards, he prescribed correction. At Guanajuatabibes, he established labor camps. Not prisons, he insisted, but places of re-education. Bureaucrats accused of laziness or corruption were sent to cut sugarcane, to sweat, to remember why the revolution had happened at all. Some called it cruelty. Ernesto called it treatment. Everything was part of the experiment. Every speech, every policy, every punishment. Could human nature be reshaped? Could a society exist where people no longer measured their worth in money? Ernesto believed it had to be possible. Because if it wasn't, then the revolution had only changed uniforms, painted new slogans, and raised a different flag over the same old world. Chapter 12. When the Revolution Let Go. By 1964, Ernesto Guevara felt out of place in the victory he had helped create. His days were filled with documents, production figures, trade negotiations, meetings that never ended. The war was over, and that, somehow, felt unbearable. He had crossed jungles with a rifle on his back, buried friends in shallow graves, watched history turn under gunfire. Now he sat behind a desk, signing papers that shaped the future in quieter ways. He had become what he once despised, a revolutionary frozen in administration, a soldier trapped inside a ministry. Every morning looked the same office, the same unresolved shortages, the same sense that history was unfolding elsewhere, without him. His first attempt to export revolution ended in silence. A small guerrilla effort aimed at Argentina collapsed almost immediately. The group was hunted down by the military. Its leader disappeared into the wilderness. No victory, no uprising, just absence. Ernesto read the reports alone. Each failure weighed heavier than the last. He was asking others to risk everything, while he remained protected by the state he had helped build. Then came February 1965, in Algiers. Standing before delegates from newly independent African nations, Ernesto spoke with the restraint of someone who no longer cared about consequences. He accused the socialist world of hypocrisy, of condemning imperialism in speeches while reproducing it through trade, debt, and dependency. Aid, he said, had become another form of control. Liberation movements were being managed, not supported. The hall erupted in applause. Moscow did not. The speech traveled fast. So did the anger it provoked. Back in Havana, Fidel Castro understood the danger immediately. Cuba depended on the Soviet Union. Oil, food, weapons. And now its most famous revolutionary had openly challenged the system that kept the island alive. Ernesto returned to Cuba in March. Then he vanished. No announcement, no explanation. One day he was there, the next, gone. Rumors spread through Havana like smoke. He had been killed. He had been imprisoned. He had lost his mind. The CIA had taken him. Fidel had silenced him. None of it was true. He was hiding, letting his beard grow uneven, learning new signatures, studying maps of places far from the Caribbean. On October 3rd, 1965, Fidel Castro appeared on television and read a letter aloud. The country listened in silence. In it, Ernesto renounced everything: his Cuban citizenship, his government posts, his military rank. He wrote that other lands now demanded his presence, that new struggles awaited, that his duty lay elsewhere. It was not a resignation. It was a severing. He also left private letters behind. To his parents, words that tried and failed to justify his choices. To his children, messages shaped carefully to their ages. Study. Be disciplined. Remember that your father loved you. To his wife, he left recordings instead of explanations. Poems read aloud, his voice steady, then faltering. Love preserved on magnetic tape. These were not the preparations of a man leaving temporarily. They were the rituals of someone who did not expect to return. By the time the letter was read on television, Ernesto Guevara was already gone, traveling under a false name, carrying a false passport, heading toward Africa. He was 36 years old and starting again from nothing. No title, no protection, no country. Only the belief that the revolution was not a place, but a condition, and that stopping meant admitting the dream had been nothing more than a story. The long goodbye was complete. Chapter 13. The Jungle That Would Not Burn. In April 1965, Ernesto Guevara stepped onto the shores of Lake Tanganyika as a man without a face. His beard was gone. Glasses hid his eyes. His name, too, had been discarded. Here he was called Tatu, the Swahili word for three. His third war. His third attempt to ignite a continent. He believed the Congo could be the fuse. Africa, the powder keg. What he found instead was disorder dressed as rebellion. The fighters waiting for him were not an army. They were fragments. Men who believed in dawa, a ritual water said to repel bullets. Before combat, a witch doctor would sprinkle it over their bodies, declaring them invincible. When the bullets killed them anyway, as bullets always do, the explanation was simple. They had not believed hard enough. Ernesto watched in silence. This was not superstition at the margins of war. It was the war. How, he wondered, do you build a revolution grounded in discipline and sacrifice with soldiers who think politics is magic? Their supposed leader, Laurent Désiré Kabila, was rarely present. When he was not drinking in distant hotels, he was making promises he had no intention of keeping. He demanded weapons, food, money, then vanished again. The rebels did not fight for liberation or ideology. They fought for whatever reward had been promised that week. Loot, power, survival. Ernesto described them as parasitic. Even that felt generous. The Cuban contingent fared no better. Veterans of the Sierra Maestra, men who had outlasted Batista's army, now faded into the jungle. Disease hollowed them out. Malaria, dysentery, fevers that blurred reality. They fired at shadows. They hesitated when real gunfire came. Some begged to leave. Others stopped speaking altogether, staring into the forest as if it were alive and waiting. The Congo did not care about ideology. Everything here killed indiscriminately. Insects, heat, mercenaries. Then, quietly, another blow arrived. A letter from Argentina. His mother, Celia, was dead. Cancer had finally ended its long siege. Ernesto read the words by candlelight, thousands of kilometers from her grave. There would be no funeral, no goodbye. He folded the letter carefully and returned to his diary. The men around him needed certainty, not grief. Steel, not flesh. He wrote instead of mourning, about exhaustion, about illusions, about revolutions that existed only on paper and in hope. By November 1965, the end was unavoidable. Government forces, backed by foreign mercenaries and American weapons, closed in from all sides. The rebellion collapsed not in a single defeat, but in quiet abandonment. Orders went unanswered. Units dissolved. The jungle swallowed the movement whole. Ernesto gave the command to retreat. Under cover of darkness, the Cubans crossed Lake Tanganyika. Some Congolese fighters tried to follow. There was no space, no supplies. They were left behind. It felt like flight. It felt like betrayal. Later, in exile, Ernesto wrote his account of the campaign. He did not soften the verdict. "This," he began, "is the story of a failure." Page after page traced how revolutions do not always die in battle. Sometimes they dissolve, through confusion, through indiscipline, through leaders who do not lead. The Congo taught him a lesson he did not want to learn. Willpower was not enough. Courage was not enough. Even conviction was not enough. Without the right people, the right conditions, the right moment, the jungle would never burn. And this time, it was the revolution that vanished into the trees. Chapter 14. Bolivia. The Last Road South. From his quiet exile in Prague, Che studied maps of Latin America the way a tired general studies an unwinnable war. His finger lingered on Bolivia. Landlocked, forgotten, yet positioned at the continent's center, touching 5 nations at once. In his mind, it was not a country, but a crossroads. If revolution could survive here, it could travel anywhere. In November 1966, he entered La Paz under a borrowed identity. Adolfo Mena Gonzalez, a balding Uruguayan economist with thick glasses and a face designed to be ignored. The customs officer barely glanced up. History slipped through the checkpoint unnoticed. The illusion of control didn't last long. Che had expected support from Bolivia's Communist Party. Instead, on New Year's Eve, its leader Mario Monge arrived with a demand. Either Monge would command the revolution, or he would abandon it entirely. Che refused, calmly, firmly. Monge walked away, taking with him the urban networks, the safe houses, the political lifeline. The revolution was left alone in the wilderness, without a spine. The peasants were meant to fill that void. Generations of hardship had shaped them, or so Che believed. But reality was colder. Many had recently received land through government reforms. They had something to lose now. When the guerrillas approached, villagers fled. When captured peasants pledged loyalty and were released, they disappeared, only to reappear as informants. Every conversation became a gamble with death. In January 1967, radio contact with Havana went silent. No explanation followed. No supplies came. No reinforcements. No escape plan. The mountains closed in, indifferent and hostile. Hunger weakened the men. Illness spread. Che's asthma returned with brutal force. He rationed medicine, then ran out. He gave orders between gasps, forcing strength into a body that was failing him. The Bolivian army was not alone. American special forces trained them in counterinsurgency, teaching them how guerrillas moved, how they thought, how they died. CIA advisors studied Che's mistakes in the Congo and turned them into a playbook. Rangers hunted patiently, tightening the circle day by day. Time was their ally. In August, the campaign shattered. At the Rio Grande, the rear guard was ambushed. 8 were killed, including Tanya Bunker, the only woman in the group, courier, communicator, link to the outside world. Her body was found downstream, unrecognizable. Che wrote that she died for what she believed in, but the words ran hollow. Belief had not killed her. Strategy had. By October, only 17 men remained, starving, exhausted, stumbling through hostile terrain. The peasants they had come to liberate guided the army toward them. Bolivian fighters deserted or fell. The Cubans unraveled, seeing danger in every ravine. Che understood the pattern. He had seen it before, written it himself in another jungle, under another sky. Revolution without conditions for revolution was not heroism. It was ritualized defeat. Still, he kept walking, because stopping would mean admitting that the idea he had given his life to, the idea that will alone could bend history, had been wrong. And Che was not yet ready to let that truth catch him. Chapter 15. The Death of a Man, the Birth of a Myth. October 8th, 1967. The Quebrada del Lloro was meant to be an exit, a narrow passage leading out of danger. Instead, it closed around them like a stone vice. Steep ravine walls rose on both sides, cutting off sightlines, sound, and hope. When Bolivian rangers appeared on the ridges above, it felt less like an ambush than an inevitability finally arriving. Che fired his M2 carbine once more before a bullet shattered it, turning the weapon into dead weight. Shrapnel tore into his leg. He tried to move, but the ground refused him. The jungle, which had hidden him for months, now held him in place. When Sergeant Bernardino stepped forward, rifle raised, Che spoke calmly. "Don't shoot. I'm Che Guevara. I'm worth more to you alive than dead." They dragged him out of the ravine and into the village of La Higuera, a place so small it barely registered on maps. Its one-room schoolhouse would soon become one of the most infamous buildings in modern history. Captain Gary Prado was stunned. The man before him bore little resemblance to the revolutionary icon feared across continents. He was dirty, wounded, exhausted, less a legend than a broken prisoner. Che made no attempt to argue otherwise. He told Prado simply that he had failed, that it was finished. The following morning, Felix Rodriguez arrived, a Cuban exile working with the CIA. He photographed Che, spoke with him, and carried instructions from Langley. Keep him alive for questioning. But the decision had already been made elsewhere. President René Barrientos wanted no trial, no platform, no prolonged detention. The problem would end quietly. Over the radio came the coded message. The execution was authorized. Sergeant Mario Terán was chosen to carry it out. He hesitated. Standing in the doorway of the classroom, rifle trembling, he faced the man who had haunted governments. Che told him to proceed, that he was only killing a man, not an idea. Terán stepped away, then returned after drinking to steady himself. At 1:10 p.m., he fired. The bullets struck Che's chest and legs. He collapsed against the dirt floor, eyes open, as if still watching something no one else could see. His body was flown by helicopter to Valle Grande, strapped to the landing skid like cargo. At the hospital, they laid him out on a concrete laundry sink. Photographers noticed the stillness of his face, the open eyes, the wounds, eerily reminiscent of Renaissance depictions of Christ. Soldiers who had hunted him reached out to touch his hair. Nuns cut locks to keep. Even in death, the room felt crowded with something larger than the moment. The military severed his hands for fingerprint identification, proof for the world that Che Guevara was truly dead. Then they buried the rest of him in secret, near an airstrip, unmarked and unceremonious. No grave to visit, no symbol to gather around. For 30 years, he remained hidden underground. In July 1997, his remains were discovered and returned to Cuba, welcomed with state ceremony and orchestration. What had been erased was restored, not quietly, but triumphantly. They had tried to make him disappear. Instead, absence refined him. A phrase appeared on a wall in Valle Grande, written by an unknown hand. Che lives, as they never wanted him to. Death succeeded where life had failed. It stripped away contradiction and defeat, transforming a flawed revolutionary into a permanent symbol. A face replicated endlessly. A dream preserved precisely because it no longer had to confront reality. Perfect, untouchable, and forever beyond compromise. Epilogue. A man who refused to stay buried. They put Che Guevara in the ground in 1967, certain that death would finish the argument. It did the opposite. Within months, his face began to travel faster than he ever had. In Paris, it appeared on dormitory walls as students stacked paving stones and waited for police charges. In May 1968, young revolutionaries who had never fired a shot marched through tear gas, carrying his image like a borrowed courage. In Berkeley, Mexico City, Tokyo, places Che had never fought. His face became a uniform for rebellion. Most of that came down to a single photograph. Taken in 1960 by Alberto Corda, it showed Che at a funeral, staring past the camera toward something unreachable. Corda never copyrighted it. He believed the revolution didn't belong to anyone. So the image escaped containment, reproduced endlessly, each copy peeling away context until only myth remained. It became the most reproduced photograph in human history. A fate that would have deeply irritated a man who despised personality cults. The irony deepened. The capitalist world Che had tried to destroy turned him into a product. By the late 20th century, you could buy Che vodka, Che cigarettes, Che swimsuits. Supermodels wore him on runways. Pop stars turned his face into an accessory worth more than a Cuban worker earned in a year. Revolution became something you could purchase. Rebellion you could swipe a card for. And yet, something more serious survived beneath the surface. In the mountains of Chiapas, Zapatista fighters carried his image beside that of Emiliano Zapata, twin ghosts of unfinished revolutions. In Colombia, guerrillas studied his manuals. In the Middle East, his face appeared beneath body armor. He became a patron saint for armed resistance everywhere, whether he would have accepted that role or not. In Cuba, Fidel Castro transformed him into a secular Christ. Statues, museums, slogans taught to children. We will be like Che. But it was a carefully edited Che. Obedient, silent, safely dead far from Havana, unable to challenge power with his impossible standards. In Bolivia, something stranger happened. The same peasants who had once informed the army began praying to him. They lit candles in La Higuera. They asked Saint Ernesto to heal their children and bring rain. The church condemned it. The people ignored them. History had completed its cruelest joke. The executed rebel became a folk saint. Academics tried to pin him down. Economists called him naive. Military historians catalogued his errors. Psychologists diagnosed him from afar. Everyone explained why he failed, yet no one could explain why he refused to disappear. Because what survived was not the strategy or the ideology. What survived was the idea that someone born into comfort could choose hardship on purpose. That a doctor could abandon safety for belief. That failure might still be meaningful if it came from attempting the impossible. Each generation found something different in his frozen gaze. Usually hope, or permission to hope. Half a century after the bullets in that schoolhouse, Che Guevara had become exactly what he never wanted to be, and exactly what history demanded. A symbol, emptied of detail, and filled with desire. Most people wearing his face never knew about the executions, the labor camps, the arguments, the contradictions. They knew only the outline, the beautiful, defiant corpse of a man who died trying to change the world. Maybe that is enough. Maybe revolutions do not win. Maybe they echo. Maybe they survive as stories long after the fighting stops. Che wanted to create the new man through discipline and sacrifice. In the end, he became one, frozen at 39, forever young, forever uncompromised, forever on the edge of a victory that would never arrive. The asthmatic boy from Argentina finally found a cure. He stopped breathing and started living everywhere. Alive in every raised fist, alive in every desperate dream, alive in a way they never wanted him to be. If you enjoyed this kind of slow, reflective history,
Stories meant not to shock, but to stay with you. Consider subscribing to the channel. Like the video if it helped you see the past more clearly, and leave a comment with the figure or era you'd like to fall asleep to next. History doesn't end. It waits to be remembered.